So I had a client ask me the other day, what are mistakes that people make when they set up a living trust? And that got me to thinking, and there are 5 main mistakes that I see people make. I'm estate planning attorney Mike Smith with Smith Barid LLC, and I'm one half of the estate planning guys. So let's talk about the 5 mistakes that I see people make when they set up a living trust. The first one is not seeking professional advice. Now, I know that there are lots of tools that you can use on the internet to do things for yourself, including setting up a living trust. In some cases, doing things yourself is great. So I like to do woodworking, for example. So I make furniture for myself. Great. I can watch YouTube videos and learn how to do that. There are other things, however, that it might not be a good idea to do yourself without some professional help. So for example, wiring your house, messing with the electricity in your house, probably not a good idea unless you really know what you're doing. You could wind up either severely injured or dead if you don't do it right. So things like that, it's really important that you seek the right professional advice. And setting up a living trust estate plan is no different. You want to have professional advice to explain the complexities involved and to make sure that everything is set up for your particular situation in the way that it needs to be. Ultimately, what happens if the trust is not set up correctly is that your family has to go through a lot of extra hassle, and that costs money and time. So the purpose of setting up a living trust in the first place, the main purpose, is to avoid having to go through a court process when you die, having your family go through a court process when you die. So having the living trust set up properly and funded properly is super important to obtaining the actual goal, the end goal of setting up a living trust. So mistake number 1, not seeking professional advice when setting up a living trust. Mistake number 2 is failing to fund the trust. So we use the word fund to talk about putting assets into the trust. So you set up the bucket and then you put the assets into the trust. And that's what we call funding. If you don't put the assets into the bucket, then it won't really do anything for you. It's just a bunch of paper. It doesn't accomplish anything unless you put the assets into the trust. The idea is that you create the trust itself with the trust document, and then you give it life basically by putting the assets into it. And if it has the assets inside the trust, then the trust owns those assets. So what happens to you is not as important to what happens with the trust assets. So for example, if you had a stroke and couldn't manage your affairs anymore, then the trustee can manage the assets in the trust for your benefit because you don't own them anymore. We don't have to go to court and do a living probate conservatorship to get control over those assets. The trustee, as the representative of the trust, which owns the assets, has control over them. Likewise, when you die, if all of the assets are in the trust, then the trustee has control over those assets. They're not in your name, so we don't have to go to a court and have an executor appointed to represent the estate. The trustee represents the trust and all the assets in the trust without having to go through any of that court process. So funding your trust is extremely important, super important piece of setting up a living trust. And without that, there's no purpose in setting up the trust in the first place. So mistake number 2 is failing to fund the trust. Mistake number 3 is neglecting to properly designate beneficiaries. So there's certain types of assets that work really well in a living trust. So your residence, for example, your vacation home, a business, bank accounts, anything like that, great assets to put in a living trust. There's certain types of assets that you cannot put into a living trust. And I have another YouTube video that explains that in more detail. So if you're interested in learning more about how we help families protect their legacies from probate, predators, and government intrusions, I wrote a free book titled The Ultimate Gift that lays it all out. If you'd like to pick up your free copy of The Ultimate Gift, simply click the link below, give us your address and a credit card for shipping and handling fees, and we'll ship it out to you free of charge. Read The Ultimate Gift so you can learn how to protect your family. But basically, things like qualified plans, so IRAs, 401ks, those cannot go into a trust. In most states, we wouldn't put automobiles into a trust. So those assets that are not in the trust, in order to make sure that they're handled properly, we need to designate beneficiaries on those. So with IRAs, for example, there are different choices you can make. If you have concerns about your beneficiaries and their ability to manage the money, then we can create a special trust that would be the recipient of the IRA upon your death, and then could control the distribution of the assets from the IRA out to those beneficiaries. So that's one example of the type of thing I'm talking about. But you want to make sure that your beneficiary designations are correct when you set up the living trust, to make sure that it all functions the way that you want it to and achieves the purposes that you have in setting up an estate planning in the first place. So mistake number 3, neglecting to designate beneficiaries correctly. Now, mistake number 4, and I see this one a lot, is failing to update the trust. So you want to think about estate planning as something you can just check off. You know, I'm going to do this thing, I'm going to create my trust, and then I don't ever want to think about that again. It's not fun. I don't want to have to talk to that lawyer again. I don't want to deal with these discussions about what happens when I die. You know, I understand all that's not fun, but it is super important that you update your trust. And I recommend that at least every 3 years you're looking at it, if not annually. Why is it so important? Well, there's several reasons why it's so important to update your trust. The first one is the law changes. So from time to time, there are changes in trust law that necessitate making changes to your trust. Quite frankly, it gets better and better. The law around trust gets better and better. So there are advantages that the law creates when the statutes change that you want to make sure are incorporated into your trust. Other things that change are like the estate tax exemptions change pretty consistently every few years, and your estate tax planning inside of your living trust needs to be adjusted to match up with what the current estate tax exemptions are. So law is one of the things that can change, that necessitates updating your trust. The second one is that you change and your family changes. So you may have kids, whether if they may be minors right now and one day they're going to grow up and go off to college, or they may already be out of college and thinking about getting married, or they may be older still and having babies of their own, or getting divorced, or owning businesses, and all of those things can impact how your trust is set up. And so as your life changes, your trust needs to be adjusted to match your current circumstances. You know, another thing that happens is a spouse passes away, and your trust needs to be adjusted at that point as well. So those life changes, second big reason that you are going to want to update your trust. And then the third thing that changes is you change your mind about things. So when you set up your trust, you may have decided, well, you know, my brother seems like a great guy. I want to have him as my trustee. And then maybe he goes through some things and you feel like he's just not at a point where he can pay attention to dealing with your trust and taking care of your kids and that sort of thing. And so you want to make a change in the trustee because you've changed your mind about it. So that is also an important reason to take a look at your trust on a periodic basis and make sure that it is adjusted to whatever your current circumstances are and what your current thinking is about what you're trying to achieve with your trust. So mistake number 4, not updating the trust. Mistake number 5 is choosing the wrong trustee. And I've seen this time and again where families chose a family member to serve as the trustee. Sometimes that can be a very good choice. Sometimes there's a family member who has the responsibility, has the maturity, has the skill to deal with serving as a trustee. And it may seem easy, you know, you're just going to write checks to the beneficiaries and no big deal. It's a lot more complicated than that because the trustee has a fiduciary responsibility to those beneficiaries. And there's 2 different types of beneficiaries they have to worry about: the current income beneficiaries and then the residual beneficiaries. And they're different, you know, they have different interests, and so the trustee has to balance those things out. The trustee is also responsible for filing tax returns and making investment decisions. So it can be a complicated role, and in some families there's someone who's perfectly suited to serve in that role. Many times I see situations where a family member was chosen by default basically to serve as the trustee, and they're just not suited for that role. And it can lead to all kinds of problems if you've got the wrong person in that role. So you need to talk with the attorney about the person that you're selecting as the trustee and make sure that they're the right fit for that job. And if you don't have somebody that can serve, then you have other options. So there are professionals who provide trustee services. Those can come through a bank, they can come through a trust company. Could be that your lawyer can provide those services, or another lawyer, a CPA, could provide those services. So there are people who have the actual expertise in providing trust fiduciary services, and that can be a really good choice. It does cost some money, but in the end, it's worth it to have a professional in place to manage the trust if you don't have a family member trustee who's up for the job. So that's mistake number 5, choosing the wrong trustee. Now, those are some mistakes that people make in setting up their living trusts. That's why people come to an estate planning attorney, is to make sure that they're not making any of those mistakes. And we help families all the time with setting up living trust. If you'd like our help, you can just click the link down below and schedule a free call with our office to see how we might be able to help you. I'm Mike Smith with Smith Barid LLC, and I'm one half of the estate planning guys, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.